Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Friday, February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day today. I'm going to do a little talk about 5 basic factors of compatibility today. So I decided to do this because it's a Hallmark holiday. You have to do something on Valentine's Day. And I was getting a bunch of emails from people being like, are you going to do something about compatibility on Valentine's Day? And I was like, "Brr." But even though I'm not like I don't love Valentine's Day, it's become more fun to celebrate Valentine's Day now that I have daughters. And I mean, my wife and I always were sort of like, you know, we love celebrating our anniversary, each other's birthdays. Valentine's Day, both of us are just like, it's all right. It's like it's not like something that we've ever been really into. But my daughter, who is in preschool, got to do her first batch of Valentine's cards for all of her classmates, and she is so jacked about it. She actually went to preschool this morning as a love farmer. So she dressed up as a farmer with red and pink, and so she was really stoked about it. Anyway, so it's become something that's fun to celebrate. And I thought, you know what? I don't think I've ever done anything on compatibility on my YouTube channel. So, why not just go for it? So I have 5 tips for compatibility if you're going to track compatibility or try to look at compatibility, and you're sort of maybe a new student of astrology, or even maybe an intermediate student of astrology. This maybe won't be so appealing to people who are really advanced because these are pretty basic tips, but let's roll through them. And I'll give you some examples too. So the first and most basic way of looking at 2 charts and just asking whether or not these charts are going to show signs of compatibility. And actually, let's back up and just talk about something even more basic, which is, what is compatibility? Well, compatibility is obviously a very subjective word. Compatibility means something different to each person who is seeking a compatibility reading. One person might want there to be sexual compatibility. Another person might want there to be, lifestyle, value, and belief compatibility. They don't rate sexual contact in the charts as high. There may also be someone who places a value on, economic stability. So you always have to remember that as an astrologer, basically what you're doing is comparing the karmas of 2 charts and trying to understand, what are you looking for, and are you hoping that it will be met in this other person, and vice versa. And even then, obviously, it's a sticky business because we're individual spirit souls whose destinies are also open to a certain extent because we're making ongoing choices. So compatibility is, obviously, it's an imperfect science. We're going to get some things really right and other things we can't necessarily predict, how people change and grow and make choices and so forth. But it's not as though we can't say anything. There are some time-tested methods that astrologers have used over thousands of years to determine whether 2 people will essentially just get along or not. And I think that's mostly what people are looking for when they do a compatibility reading. The other thing you have to remember is that astrology has a long history of using techniques like horary astrology. Horary astrology is a particular type of astrology. We use the techniques of horary astrology, I should say, to basically determine whether or not a relationship is going to last, or if it's going to break up, or whatever. I probably take 100 questions a year in my horary practice from people saying, is this a good match? Or, will she call me back? Or will we get married? Or, does he really like me? Or is he seeing someone else? Or whatever the case might be. And we can determine with great accuracy, great predictive, specific accuracy at times, what's going to happen in a relationship, how it's going to pan out. It's not necessary to know how it's going to pan out either. Some people have a lot of anxiety about it, and they want to try to make a decision to stay or to go or whatever. And so astrology, horary, predictive astrology, can be very helpful in that regard. For other people, like, sometimes my advice is basically just enjoy the relationship, see what it has in store for you. Let it speak in its own way, because we're so obsessed with this idea of soulmates, where we want that one person to be with us forever and ever and just be perfect. For most people, that doesn't exist, right? There's not there. Even if you do are only with one person in this lifetime, which is actually more and more these days. In my own practice is very rare. I'd say like probably 70% of the clients I see who are, say, in their 50s or 60s have had more than one marriage. Um, but all of that aside, it's also part of a fantasy that we have where we're always looking for perfection. We have ideals, especially in the West, where we're really sort of utopians at heart. We're looking for the perfect saving relationship, the perfect saving society. And it's good to set our sights high. It's good to have ideals. It's good to have, something that we're aiming for. But also, time-tested wisdom of yogis and ancient mystics who practice astrology is also that, look, life includes lots of ups and downs, and it doesn't necessarily help us to have whimsical ideas about, um, you know, uh, the ultimate ideal romantic situation. So, I always have to just remember that there's a real romanticism here in the West with this idea of the perfect soulmate. And even if we do find someone we are with for a long time, oftentimes the nature of that relationship is more about the work that we are compelled to do by virtue of looking in the karmic mirror of another soul. So just remembering those things, sobering up a little bit before we do relationship astrology is important. It can't tell us everything. It doesn't. There is no guarantee that your chart includes a perfect soulmate. It may include many people in your life that you're with that are very meaningful to you, but not necessarily one that's happily ever after. And also, if we do have someone in our lives, we have to remember that people are imperfect and not everything is ever going to match. There's always going to be areas in compatibility comparisons that are just messy. So now that I was a total buzzkill on this Valentine's Day, let's talk about 5 features of compatibility that you can look at. And I find that these are pretty time-tested and true in terms of seeing, some basic ways in which souls will more or less get along and find harmony with one another. This could even be in the level of business partners or friends. So at any rate, now the first one is sun, moon, and rising compatibility. Very, very basic. What you want to see are sun, moon, and rising signs that match in terms of elemental compatibility. Meaning, if you Taurus, if you're a Capricorn, Taurus, or Virgo rising, ideally you would see someone with an earth sign rising as well, or a water sign rising. It's just to say that you have basic earth, water, yin compatibility between your rising signs. That's simple. Same thing goes with the sun and the moon. We love to see trines between the sun and the moon, which means they don't have to be degree based, it can just be whole sign. So for example, your moon is in Taurus and my moon is in Virgo, or your moon is in Leo and my moon is in Aries. When you have that match compatibility wise between the sun or the moon from one element to another, that's one of the peak conditions of compatibility. And just in terms of having a basic familiarity and comfort with where another person is coming from and kind of how they operate in the world. So sextiles can work as well. So for example, I'm a Cancer sun and you're a Virgo moon, or you're a Virgo sun, something like that. Typically, and this goes all the way back to Ptolemy, you want to see contact between one person's moon and the other person's sun, and vice versa. So the contact can also go, say, for example, in a heterosexual dynamic, let's say just for an example, you have kind of stereotypical man-woman situation. Man's sun wants to be in sextile or trine by whole sign to woman's moon. And then you could also say, vice versa. You want the man's moon to be in contact with the woman's sun. So they cross over. They're kind of crossing like that. So if you have that kind of compatibility, generally speaking, even just one of those factors of compatibility between the sun, the moon, and the rising sign, with either trines, whole sign trines, or sextiles between your ascending sign or your sun sign or your moon sign, if you have a couple of those factors between your charts, you're usually going to see that there's some way in which there's just ease, familiarity, comfort, a similar way of operating in the world. And that's because the lights really are central to defining the karmic field of our experience, both inner and outer. And so that elemental compatibility between the lights and the ascendant is huge. the other thing that's sneaky is that the ascendant ruler is also really important. So it's not just your rising sign, it's the ruling planet of your rising sign. So for example, if you have Venus in, let's say, Venus in Gemini, as you're a Taurus rising and you have Venus in Gemini, then you would also, it wouldn't be bad, for example, to see harmony between your Venus in Gemini and the other person's ascending ruler. So let's say they're like, they are a Mercury rising individual. They're a Virgo rising, and they have Mercury in Mercury in Gemini. Let's say it's a Gemini rising, right, with the Mercury in their home sign and first house. Well, then you would have compatibility between your ascendant rulers, and that's in my experience, that is a huge compatibility factor, because your rising, the ruling planet of your rising sign, is huge when it comes to just the understanding of your character and personality in the world, your essential sense of self and how it works in the world. So yeah, that can be a really important factor. And but you can compare rising signs as well. So anyway, that's the first one. Just check out sun, moon, rising compatibility. And elemental kinship will usually provoke or promote harmony and some degree of ease between two individuals. What you want to be careful of are going to be the squares and oppositions. So especially probably more the squares in some ways, but oppositions can be a little bit rough too. So if I'm a Cancer sun and I'm with a Capricorn sun, our suns are opposed, that can be a little bit challenging. Similarly, if I'm a Taurus rising and I'm with a Scorpio rising, the opposite sign. So when you get those opposites, those can sometimes mean that there's more of a butting of heads. Sometimes though, you know, it's true that opposites can complement one another. So that's not 100%, it's not 100% difficult. It's obviously, there can be some interesting exchanges that can happen there as well. But typically speaking, opposites can be more difficult. So can squares. If I'm a Cancer rising and I'm with an Aries rising, right? That the kind of square between the lights, the square between the ascendant, the ascending signs, those are things to watch for as well. So typically squares and oppositions between the lights, more difficult. Sextiles and trines between the lights, better, and rising signs included in that. Now, two, just generally speaking, is elemental compatibility. Like if you look at a chart and you're like, oh, look, this person that I'm with has a ton of earth energy, and it turns out that I've got a bunch of water energy in my chart. There's predominance of one element or another element or two elements, and you have similar or compatible elemental predominance in your chart. That can be another just general sign of compatibility of working together. Now, these are all just kind of like rules of thumb. There's always exceptions, and it's not a mechanical thing, right? Predominance of angular planets is another one. Planets that you have that are near the ascendant or descendant, midheaven or IC, or in the first, 10th, 7th, or 4th houses speak very loudly. So if you have a really dominant Mars at the top of your chart, let's say, and you know, the other person has a really dominant moon, you want to be careful, because if you have a planet that's at an angle or really pronounced in an angular house, especially with like a lot of dignity, basically what you're saying is like, this planet is really loud. And if that planet has an inherent difficulty, or say square or opposition to a dominant planet in the other person's chart, you could be looking at a problem. For example, let's say again that you have Mars in Aries at the midheaven in your chart, and let's say your spouse or your partner has Cancer rising with the moon in Cancer right on the ascendant. Okay, well, there could very easily be a dominance of Mars energy in one chart and moon energy in another chart. And like, doesn't, in some ways it doesn't, that could just be a sign of clashing. So you always have to be careful about dominant planets in the angles and how dominant planets in the angles may conflict from one chart to the next. I don't I do chart comparing. I don't do composite charts where you blend the two charts together as one. That's just me personally. So predominance of angular planets and how they speak, or kind of, you know, do the planets really get along? So for example, another person may be Mercury, Venus, you know, right at the midheaven, or right in the 7th house, right on the descendant. and the other person has a Mars Saturn energy, you know, right at the midheaven or right in the seventh house. It's like, okay, that's two very different ways of interacting with people. Mercury Venus is going to be playful, clever, artistic, you know, intelligent, etc. Mars Saturn might be much more disciplined, austere, hardworking, you know, a little bit more severe, right? So watch the planetary, watch for dominant planets or planetary configurations, planetary combinations in one chart compared to another, and see if they seem to get along or not. On the other hand, you might see someone who has, you know, a dominant moon and someone else who has a dominant Venus, and they're both in water signs. Okay, well, that you're going to see more harmony in people who have dominant planets at the angles in, you know, similar signs and their similar dispositions, Venus and the moon both being, you know, more oriented toward the goddess, let's say. So, you know, things like that can kind of be a hint, but it's obviously it's so contextual. Every chart is so specific that it's not like I said, it's not like a mechanistic science here. The other thing that I find really important in synastry is to read the seventh house in both charts. So I'm actually going to show you an example right now, just based on the current transits and like what, you know, if this chart was before us, like what might we notice? Okay, so let's just say that this is our chart on the screen right here. And let's go ahead and I'm just going to highlight for you the seventh house karma. Okay, so like this person has, let's just say this is their birth chart, and you're comparing charts. You're like, okay, look, this person has Scorpio moon right on the descendant. So there's a dominant planet, moon in a Mars ruled sign in its fall. And then you have Mars ruling that angular house in the eighth house. Okay. So that's a little bit of a rough placement in terms of potentially dealing with, say, volatile emotions, or someone who has very intense feelings, or who may marry someone who is very intense emotionally, maybe really smart and adventurous, but also maybe, you know, really sort of driven by their ideals and beliefs, and maybe a little intense about them. Okay, we're just combining moon and Scorpio with Mars and Sagittarius, getting a feel for it. And that gives us something about their karma in relationships, either what the relationship will be like, or maybe some characteristics of the partner. You go, okay, so let's just randomly, right? Let's just go forward a year from now. And let's go to some other time of day. All right, so now let's see here. Okay, yeah, this is a good one. So second person we're looking at, and we go, oh, look, they have the moon in Aries in the seventh house, and Mars, oh, look, it's in the eighth house, right? In which case, one pattern stands out right away. You're like, oh, look, they have the same configuration, moon in the seventh in a Mars ruled sign with Mars in the eighth. So in that way, even if it might look a little bit difficult, part of what you're seeing is like, yeah, there is some deeper fated reason for their meeting, because you can see basic patterns playing out in the seventh houses of the charts. And maybe they're there to have different ways of dealing with conflict, or different ways of expressing their will in the world. And they're going to be, you know, teachers for each other in that regard. You could give them some advice maybe about utilizing Mars energy in the relationship appropriately. Let's go to another one. Let's just kind of pretend that we have a totally different scenario, but let's keep the Scorpio moon from the first one in mind as well. So in this chart, let's just imagine this is our second chart. Now we have Gemini on the seventh house cusp, and we have Mercury as the planet ruling. And look at Mercury. Oh my gosh, right? Mercury's in the third house and it's retrograde, and it's with Jupiter, and it's with Venus, and it's with the sun, and it's with Saturn. So a huge stellium of third house energy. Well, where that other person, the first person we started with, might have deeper, more intense emotional dynamism in their relationship, this person is either looking for or will exhibit in their relationships maybe more rational, mental, communicative qualities. And this is obviously just a very brief kind of generic interpretation, but you can see that by comparing, you know, that Scorpio moon with Mars and Sagittarius to a Gemini seventh house with a Mercury in a load of air signs in the third house, you just get a very different feeling in terms of what a person needs or wants in a relationship. So, for example, if I were to compare these two, I'd be like, this person's going to be open-minded, and the other person may be more convicted and intense and passionate, and even a little bit more stubborn about their beliefs, because you got a fixed moon in Mars' sign with Mars in a fire sign. This is, Aries seventh house with a ton of airy planets in the third house. I think that, the moods are going to be very different in terms of the karma of the relationship. And that's an important level of analysis always. Sometimes it takes an astrologer actually looking at those things and breaking them down. I'm obviously just making this one up on the spot, but sometimes, you have to just sit back and go, look, compatibility in the charts in some ways is sort of secondary to comparison of the seventh house karma in both charts, which is the marriage or relationship house. So that's the fourth. Fifth, and final, which I kind of started with, is remember when you're doing compatibility between yourself and another person, remember that when people come into your life and they're touching your heart, they're speaking to your soul, you're speaking to your mind. We have many karmic relationships in this lifetime that are really meaningful and there for reasons that we can't always see or understand. And sometimes it's not a good idea to try to control all of that too much. So looking at compatibility for fun in order to understand who we are and how we get along, great idea. In order to determine whether or not I can trust the situation and whether or not it's my soulmate and all of that. Got to be really careful of that, because again, maybe we have many soulmates that are here for different reasons. Maybe we will have a partner that'll last longer and that'll be more stable and secure over a longer period of time. Maybe. But if someone's come into our life, unless we have major red flags and we're really anxious, like I really feel like I need some insight here, because I'm feeling like it's time for me to make a decision about this. So astrology can be really good for that. But we don't want to obsess and kill the natural, spontaneous intimacy that two people are really creating in some ways, despite whatever the charts say. Remember, the charts tell us about the karmic field, and they may tell us something about the parameters of the karma that we're working with in relationships, and some fated events in relationships. But they, we are also free agents. We have free will, and so it's up to us to create intimacy and meaning. And the definition of a good relationship ultimately is whether or not, in my opinion, the person that we are with and as a couple, that we uphold and support one another in our spiritual development in life. If a person's spirituality isn't the number one thing in their life, in my humble opinion, relationships will end up bearing the weight of not having that priority straight. And relationships can't do that. And so one of the simplest things that we can do for each other in relationships is, put each other's spiritual life first. Put the welfare of your partner's spiritual existence first. Support that at all costs. If they support yours at all costs, in some ways, even if the relationship doesn't last, it will have been a success. It will have been an ally that you met on the path. And what more can we ask for, right? So I hope that all this was kind of fun. It's just a simple little thing I threw together at the last minute. I hope that you guys enjoy this and have a happy Valentine's Day if you are celebrating. Remember this too. If you're alone today and this kind of holiday that, makes you like lonely, or like you have to, take a bubble bath and listen to The Cure or something like that because you're not like perfectly in love or whatever. Just remember that, love is messy too. And sometimes we should all be so lucky as to have, as a parent who doesn't get a lot of alone time anymore, both my wife and I are like, God, grass is always greener. You know what I mean? Like once you're in married life and you have kids or whatever, sometimes you just crave being alone. And once you're alone, then of course we tend to crave being with someone. So this is a good day, if you're not with someone, you're not doing all of that, to just love yourself and prioritize the love that's in your heart, that's connected to the source of your very being, and send God a Valentine's Day love letter today. And you'd be surprised how much that we get a couple of Valentine's, notes right back from the universe when we take the time to love rather than lament the fact that we don't have some kind of ideal situation in love or whatever. So My wife and I are going to our local temple today to offer our love to Krishna and Radha. That's was the best thing we could think of, how to do, how to show love on this kind of cheesy Hallmark day, I guess. Um, so I hope that you guys also find connection to the universal love, which is really what matters. So, okay, happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Take care. Bye.